private dining room at Bellissimo had been reserved for 3 months, and everyone knew it. Mom's 60th birthday was supposed to be flawless, the kind of event people would still talk about years later. 23 family members, Italian marble tables polished to a shine, fresh white orchids placed carefully at every setting. My sister Jessica had made sure everyone understood how much effort went into it. She had spent weeks planning, and at least 40 minutes that evening, alone, describing the planning process to anyone who would listen, whether they asked or not. I arrived exactly on time, not early enough to look desperate and not late enough to be noticed. I wore the gray dress my mother had once called mousy, a word she had said with a polite smile that somehow still stung years later. When I walked in, my parents barely glanced up. My dad was already deep in conversation with my brother-in-law, proudly showing him photos of his new golf clubs on his phone. My mom was admiring Jessica's Honda CRV key fob like it was a Cartier bracelet, turning it over in her hands with exaggerated appreciation. Fully loaded, Jessica announced, loudly, for the 3rd time that night. Leather seats, panoramic sunroof, the works. Eric and I decided we deserved something nice. She said it with the confidence of someone used to being admired. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, next to my cousin's son, who didn't even look up from his tablet. The seating chart had been strategically planned, according to Jessica. Strategic, in this case, meant I was placed as far away from the birthday girl as physically possible while still being in the same room. I didn't comment. I rarely did anymore. It was easier that way. Uncle Tom arrived 20 minutes late, slightly out of breath, his tie crooked and his hair a little messier than usual. He was my father's younger brother, a patent attorney in Silicon Valley who only visited Boston a couple of times a year. We stayed in touch mostly through emails, usually about obscure intellectual property questions that came up during my work. Sorry, he said as he leaned in to kiss my mom on the cheek, then scanned the table. When his eyes landed on me, his face lit up. Emma, there you are. He practically jogged toward my end of the table, completely ignoring the empty seat beside my father that had clearly been reserved for him. I stood to hug him, genuinely happy to see a familiar face that didn't look through me. How's life after that $3.8 million patent sale? He asked casually, his voice carrying just enough to cut through a brief lull in conversation. I told my partners about your moisture detection coating technology. Brilliant work. The room didn't just go quiet. It went silent in that sharp, uncomfortable way that makes your ears ring. Jessica froze mid-sentence, the story about her Honda's Bluetooth issues dying right on her lips. My brother-in-law's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. My father's hand froze around his water glass. My mother's expression shifted rapidly, moving from confusion to recognition to panic, before settling into a strained attempt at a smile. What, Patan? She whispered, though somehow her voice reached every corner of the room. I calmly took a sip of my wine and let the moment breathe. Uncle Tom, completely unaware of the explosion he'd just triggered, continued enthusiastically. He talked about agricultural applications, about licensing deals, about how the technology could revolutionize crop management in drought-prone regions. You sold a patent, my father said slowly, each word carefully measured, for $3.8 million. Last April, I replied simply. The deal closed on the 15th. My mother stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Last April, she repeated. That's almost a year ago. 11 months, I confirmed. Jessica finally found her voice. You're lying. You work at a library. I shook my head gently. I'm a research chemist at Dendrite Solutions. I've been there for 6 years. The library job was during my PhD program, which ended in 2019. My mom started to speak, but I continued softly. I never told you I worked at a library. When I mentioned my research position, you said, "That's nice, dear," and changed the subject to Jessica's promotion at Target. I stopped correcting the assumption after the 3rd family dinner. Uncle Tom's expression shifted as awareness finally set in. Wait, they didn't know? No, I said. They didn't. My father looked stunned, almost What is this? Some kind of secret life? It wasn't a secret, I replied. You just weren't listening. I reminded them about the invitations they never responded to. The dissertation I mailed that was never mentioned. The phone calls cut short because something more important was happening in Jessica's life. When Uncle Tom mentioned my doctorate from MIT out loud, the words sounded foreign in the room, like they didn't belong to me. My cousin Rachel started laughing halfway down the table, not politely but uncontrollably, pointing out how my mother had once described me as finally holding down a steady job, shelving books. Plates of appetizers arrived, but no one touched them. The air felt heavy, thick with realization and embarrassment. Jessica tried to regain control, talking about work-life balance and real leadership, but even she sounded unsure now. Uncle Tom kept adding details about my work, my patents, my projects, each sentence making the silence heavier than the last. By the time my mother realized the $3.8 million deal was my smallest one, her hands were shaking. Jessica accused me of exaggerating. I corrected her calmly, explaining licensing, royalties, and tie-ins. When my brother-in-law finally spoke, it was to recall a moment when Jessica had suggested I apply at her Target store because she could put in a good word. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was doing all the work for me. My father asked why I hadn't told them. I told him I had, over and over again. Uncle Tom backed me up, reminding them of dinners where I was ignored, forgotten, dismissed. My mother tried to protest, but the words died in her throat. Then, Uncle Tom mentioned the phone call from last April, the one where I cried after they hung up on me. I remembered standing alone in my apartment, staring at the offer letter, listening to the dial tone. The memory still hurt, but it didn't control me anymore. When Jessica tried to shut the conversation down by saying it was Mom's birthday dinner, I agreed. I stood up, pulled an envelope from my purse, and placed it gently in front of my mother. "Happy birthday," I said. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a check for $50,000. She stared at it, like it might disappear. "It's a gift," I said calmly, "for the kitchen renovation Dad mentioned." My father said they couldn't accept it, but his eyes never left the check. My mother started crying, real tears this time. She apologized, saying she never meant to make me feel invisible. I told her gently that intent didn't erase impact. My father promised they would do better, that they would listen. I said I wanted that, but only if it meant real change. Rachel raised her glass, calling me the most successful person at the table and the one treated the worst. No one argued. The waiter returned, asking if everything was all right. I ordered my main course calmly, as if the entire room hadn't just shifted on its axis. The dinner continued, but nothing felt the same anymore, and that was only the beginning. The dinner moved forward in a strange, fragile way, like everyone was afraid the table might crack if they leaned too hard on the conversation. Uncle Tom stayed seated beside me, as if anchoring me there, occasionally filling the silence by explaining details about my work that my parents listened to with a mix of shock and guilt. Jessica barely spoke, pushing her food around her plate. The confidence she'd carried all evening drained out of her. Eric kept glancing back and forth between his wife and me, his expression tight, like he was watching something he didn't fully understand but knew was important. The laughter and easy chatter that usually defined our family dinners never returned that night. Instead, there was a careful politeness, everyone choosing words like they were stepping through broken glass. During the main course, my father surprised me. He cleared his throat and asked, "So? What are you working on now?" It was the first time he'd asked me anything about my work in over 5 years. I paused for just a moment, then told him about the biodegradable plastic project, about the team I was leading, about the goal of creating materials that could replace single-use plastics without harming the environment. As I spoke, I noticed something unfamiliar on his face. He wasn't waiting for his turn to talk. He was actually listening. He asked follow-up questions, real ones, about durability, about cost, about scalability. I answered them honestly, explaining both the promise and the challenges. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't performing for approval. I was simply sharing a part of my life. My mother barely touched her food. Her eyes kept drifting between me and the envelope she'd placed beside her plate, as if she needed to see it to believe it was real. When dessert had arrived, complete with sparklers and dramatic flair, Jessica made one last attempt to reclaim the evening. "So, Mom," she said, forcing a smile, "what do you think of your party?" My mother didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but quiet. "I think she said slowly, that I've been a terrible mother to one of my daughters. Jessica flinched immediately, but my mother wasn't finished. Both of you, she added. Emma, I failed you by not seeing you. Jessica, I failed you by letting you believe you had to be better than your sister to matter. The words landed hard. No one spoke. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it was honest, and that made it heavier. After dinner, people began to leave in small groups, murmuring goodbyes that sounded different than usual. My father pulled me aside near the entrance. About the kitchen renovation, he said awkwardly. Could we hire you as a consultant? I almost laughed. I designed polymers, Dad, not kitchens. He nodded quickly. I know, you understand materials, durability. I want to understand what you do. I thought maybe you could teach me something. He looked older in that moment, smaller somehow. I'd like that, I said. It felt like a start, not a solution, but a real start. Uncle Tom drove me home that night. The car ride was quiet for a few minutes before he spoke. You handled that with remarkable grace. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past. Did I have a choice? I asked. He smiled softly. He had several. You chose the kind one. 3 weeks later, I received an email from my mother. No subject line, just a single sentence. I framed your diploma. It's hanging in the living room. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you received it. It was a small thing, but small things had been missing for a long time. My father called the following Tuesday, asking about carbon fiber composites for a backyard project he was supposedly planning. The project felt like an excuse, but I didn't mime. We talked for 47 minutes. He didn't rush me once. 2 months after the dinner, Jessica sent me a text. I'm sorry I was threatened by your success. I'm working on it. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I'm sorry I let you think we were competing. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped in a bow, but it was honest. The kitchen renovation began in May, and my parents consulted me on every material choice, asking questions that showed they were trying to understand, not just impress. My mother started attending community college lectures on environmental science and forwarded me articles she thought I'd like. At Jessica's birthday dinner in July, my mom introduced me as Dr. Emma Richardson, our daughter, the research chemist, her voice filled with a pride that sounded real. Then she spent an equal amount of time talking about Jessica's promotion to department manager. It wasn't perfect, but it was balanced, and for the first time, balance felt like progress. Uncle Tom and I had lunch the week after Jessica's birthday, sitting at a small cafe near the river. He watched me carefully as I stirred my coffee, like he was trying to read something beneath the surface. So, he asked, how does it feel now? I've thought about the question longer than I expected. Strange, I admitted. I spent so long being invisible that being seen feels almost uncomfortable. He smiled, that knowing smile he used in courtrooms. You'll adjust, he said. You're brilliant at adapting. A few weeks later, the biodegradable plastic project received preliminary approval for large-scale testing. My team celebrated in the lab with cheap champagne poured into mismatched beakers. I took a photo of all of us, slightly blurry and laughing, and sent it to the family group chat. My mom replied within minutes, asking thoughtful questions about the science. Jessica sent a congratulations gift. My dad called that evening and asked me to explain the project from the beginning. I talked for 40 minutes straight. He listened to every word without once changing the subject. In November, I received an invitation to speak at an environmental summit in Stockholm. The speaking fee alone was $35,000. I accepted without hesitation, then forwarded the invitation to my parents with a short note saying that if they wanted to attend, I'd like to buy their tickets. They both came. They sat in the front row during my keynote, my mom clutching her program like it was something sacred. When the standing ovation started, I saw her crying, openly, without trying to hide it. At the airport on the way home, my father turned to me and said quietly, I miss so much of your life. I nodded. Yes, I said. He swallowed and asked, can I be there for the rest of it? I thought about all the years of being overlooked, the casual dismissals, the way invisibility can become a habit. Then I thought about effort, real effort. As I said, it wasn't perfect after that. Jessica and I still had awkward moments. My parents still slipped into old patterns sometimes, catching themselves mid-sentence and apologizing, but they were trying. and that mattered. On Christmas, Uncle Tom raised a toast. To Emma, he said, who taught us that the quietest person in the room might be the most accomplished. And 2 second chances, my mom added softly. I raised my glass with them. To family, I thought, the complicated, messy, imperfect, kind that chooses to do the work to be better. The patents kept coming, the projects kept succeeding. But the real victory wasn't in the numbers or the accolade. It was in the phone calls where my father asked about my day, in the articles my mother sent, in Jessica's texts that no longer felt like competitions. I had spent years being invisible. Now I was seen. Not because of money or patents or titles, but because the people who mattered were finally paying attention. The revelation at my mother's birthday dinner hadn't been revenge. The real triumph was what came after. The grace I chose, the life I built, and the space I allowed for change. Their past failures didn't define me. In the end, being seen wasn't about proving my worth. It was about refusing to let anyone else's blindness decide it for me.